is that you never know when the audience gives that cue that you can now start and they're all ready. So I think we're good to go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third season of Summer of ISHQ. I am Samreen Mushtaq, a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University. So today is our second session of this year's Summer of ISHQ series, which is organized by the Center. Our first session last week was a provocative conversation around the question, where is the trans in translation? And we are back today with another very, very important session considering the times that we're living in. And the question that we're posing today is, what are the sexual politics of nationalism? We have two brilliant professors with us who I'll introduce in a bit, but more about this question. So the way that we see nationalism rearing its ugly head now, this absolute normalizing of a politics of hatred and fear, the dread that so many of us wake up with each day as we wonder what today's news will bring. The forms in which we see violence inflicted on certain bodies, on memories, on histories, and on homes. It's like we're seeing very little of ISHQ and a lot more hate, whose scale and impact is only amplified each day as we see it. So it's only fitting that we have Professor Sara Farris and Professor Dibyesh Anand with us today as we talk nationalism, dissent, and try to find some hope in some of these spaces, solidarities, and radical imaginings. Professor Dibyesh Anand is the head of school social sciences at the University of Westminster in London. Professor Sara R. Farris is the reader of sociology at the Goldsmiths, University of London. Before we proceed, a quick note on the format, although I'm sure that so many of you would already be familiar with the format since this is the third year when we are having the Summer of ISHQ series, but let me just repeat it before we dive into the session. So we'll start with each speaker speaking for about 10 minutes. This will be followed by 10 minutes of a cross-pollinated conversation with speakers before we move to 30 minutes dedicated to questions from the audience. My colleague Shreyashi will be curating the Q&A. And for those of you who have any questions through the course of this conversation, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. On to the session now, and I invite our first speaker, Professor Dibyesh Anand, to interpret as you will this broad question, what are the sexual politics of nationalism?
Thank you, Samreen. Thank you, Shreyashi. Thank you, ISHQ, for inviting us here. Again, you could start with not calling me Professor Anand, but just Dibyesh is fine. I like my name Dibyesh. Without Professor, it's okay. Now, of course, we are doing it online, so there's always a risk of bad connection. And I'm speaking from another city with the conference, sitting in corner of a hotel. It looks fine here, but I am sure there'll be noise and disturbance from time to time. Now, when I was asked to speak about sexual politics of nationalism, I could have spoken of various aspects of my own research, which are, of course, directly connected to the political subjects that Samreen raised about. I could speak explicitly about Hindu nationalism in India, which has been one of the areas of my work, and the very explicit and lethal politics of sexuality and gender that Hindutva engages in. I could also speak about Kashmir, another area of my own research, and the ways in which, of course, India occupies Kashmir and the ways in which it generates and deploys certain kind of gender and sexual politics. I could also speak, of course, of China and Tibet and China and Uyghurs, because that's another area and my main area of work where the Chinese Communist state deploys a language of liberation and emancipation and civilizing, which is again very gendered in similar kind of colonial occupation style. I could speak, of course, of my another area of work and my own politics, which is around queering the state, decolonizing the state. So my own work is on how we have to link our queering the self and queering the self, and I identify the queer in political and personal terms, how we have to link our queer politics with essentially challenging the colonial practices of post-colonial states. And my own work has been on China vis-a-vis Uyghurs and Tibetans and India vis-a-vis Kashmiris. So I could talk of all of this. I'm not going to talk all of it, but of course that can come during question and answer. let me start with the basic thing, which I'll do with, because I don't know who you all are in the audience. Some of you might be experts on nationalism more than I am, and some of you might be students who might have known about nationalism. You deal with nationalism, but you have not studied nationalism. So I'm trying to balance between those who are experts and those who are not. So I'm assuming that some in the audience would know a bit about nationalism, but not know it in great detail. So that's the level at which I'm pitching my talk. Now, nationalism at the very core is a politics of self and the other. So we are Indian vis-a-vis others. The others might be Pakistanis, Chinese, Westerners, doesn't matter. So nationalism at the very basis is the politics of self and the other. Now, the self politics is about an ideal self. So who is an ideal self? Who's an ideal Briton? Who's an ideal French? Who's an ideal Indian? Who's an ideal Pakistani? Who's an ideal Tibetan? There's a concept of ideal. So when we look at nationalism as a very basic, it is about ideal self vis-a-vis others. Now, others might be external others or internal others, but it is very much the other. So nationalism at the very simple, in simple terms, is about creation of and a construction of an ideal self vis-a-vis others. Now, that ideal self is essentially a gendered self. When I say gendered self, it might be a feminized self, it might be a masculinized self, it might be a hyper-masculinized self, but it is essentially gendered self. So you cannot have a nationalism that's devoid of gender politics, that's devoid of sexual politics. So the ideal self in certain contexts would, and in most contexts, is a masculine self. In some sense, it's a hyper-masculine self. In other contexts, it is a responsible masculine vis-a-vis hyper-masculinity of the enemy others. So the problem for certain form of masculine nationalist identity and national self is there's a hyper-masculine other and also a feminine other and a feminine self, which is sort of corroding and weakening the masculine self, right? So we have to be aware that creation of nationalist self is not always a hyper-masculine self. It can be a responsible masculine self vis-a-vis hyper-masculine other and also a feminine self, right? So, but it's very clear that the ideal self, the nationalist self, is almost always a masculine self. But increasingly, we also find a feminine self that's seen as part of the ideal masculine nationalism. That feminine self would be one that's generally, not always, generally subservient, a mother figure, a sister figure, a daughter figure, but never an equal friend figure. In most cases, not all cases. But you will have contexts where, and I'm even using Hindutva example. Hindutva is a regressive nationalism. Yet it has found ways in which, and people have worked since 1990s, various feminist scholars have highlighted the ways in which the Hindutva nationalist movement has also taken into account and involved Hindu right-wing women. Now, what I would caution against is seeing Hindutva right-wing women as victims or as subservient. They might be subservient in the wider project where they have been very active in playing a very crucial role of almost, it's not feminist, remember, they'll never use the word feminist, but almost feminist-like active agents of nationalism. And there the Hindutva women, different from in 1990, when most of the work was done on Hindutva women, Hindutva right-wing women and Hindu nationalism, where the focus was on them as almost secondary. If you look at Hindutva women today, you do find them playing a very crucial and integral role in justifying Hindutva nationalism as almost not progressive, but almost better than other forms of nationalism that doesn't give equal platform to women. That's taking place, right? So the ideal self in nationalism is masculine, it can be feminine, it can be even homo-nationalist, where certain gay identities can be appropriated. Again, not so much in case of Hindutva. We do have phenomena of homo-nationalism in India, but we have to distinguish between Hindutva, that is almost never homo-nationalist, and those privileged cis male gay activists, mostly from upper caste, right, who will want to be partners of Hindutva and say, oh, look at us. Hindutva is better than Islam. Hindutva is better than other forms of religion. So if you take language of Amit Shah or Narendra Modi, they will never talk of homo-nationalism. So the leaders of Hindutva will not talk of homo-nationalism, but you'd have some LGB activists in India who try and refer to Hindutva as some kind of liberation vis-a-vis other forms of nationalism. So that's the kind of thing. And of course, my colleague who's at Westminster University, Natasha Call, some of you have worked on Kashmir would know of her. And of course, those who work on Hindutva also would know of her. She has written very explicitly about the ways in which there's a gendered obsession with Kashmir in Hindutva. So she again looks at not only the gendered obsession with Kashmir, in terms of the possession, the proprietorial tone that India adopts, that Kashmir belongs to us, the way in which my wife belongs to me, the woman belongs to me kind of thing. But she also looks at femo-nationalism, the way in which there's a particular half-baked progressive language of feminism that's deployed by Hindutva, right? All of that you would be familiar. And if not, please go and check out her work, Natasha, all right? But what I want to focus on is the ways the ways in which lethal politics of violence is integral to this gendered and sexual politics. When I say lethal politics of violence, in my own work on Hindu nationalism, I've looked at what I call porno nationalism. And I've not used porno nationalism to be provocative. I call Hindutva porno nationalist, and I'll summarize with that is, it's porno nationalist because the only imagination for of Muslims and Christians, but Muslims in Hindutva, is of the hypersexualized Muslim male. In recent times, you would have come across what I even forget her name, Madhu Kishwar, talking of Sand, bull, right? So she refers to Muslim men as bulls, but she doesn't refer to them as bulls. That, and we can laugh. And I remember on social media, a lot of people were laughing about this image of Muslim men as hyper-masculine. And they were almost replying back to say, yes, we are hyper-masculine. So what? Your men are not as good as we are. But what people were missing out was not the bull part, which is hyper-masculinity part, but her talking of trained bulls. She was not referring to Muslims as bulls. She was referring to Muslims as trained bulls. And the trained part is the crucial part, not the hyper-masculine part. Because what she was referring to was a very common trope that Hindutva has about Muslims, that Muslims are not hyper-masculine by nature. Of course, and in my own work, again, please go and check Hindu nationalism in India and politics of fear. I have explained all of this in great detail. The ways in which, of course, the imagination Muslim is because why are Muslim men hyper-masculine? That's religion, that's culture, that's circumcised penis. Again, I go into all of this in detail. But the reason they're seen as a hyper-masculine because they're seen as part and parcel of a wider conspiracy. That's why they're trained. That Muslim men are hyper-masculine because they're trained to be hyper-masculine in order to then seduce Hindu women and take over India. So the trained part is the crucial one, because once you acknowledge that in this worldview, that Muslim men are not only hyper-masculine and dangerous, but trained, then you see a conspiracy. Then how do you respond to conspiracy? You can't respond to conspiracy by saying to Muslim men that, okay, let us make them less hyper-masculine. Let us make them more progressive. That's not the answer, because if they are part of a wider conspiracy, the only way to respond to that conspiracy is by replying them in return. So you seduce Muslim women, you demonize them, you take over them, you rape them, you emasculate, that's the language they'll use, you castrate Muslim men, because all of this is justified on the grounds that because Muslim men are part and parcel of a wider conspiracy, a political conspiracy to take over India, the only way to respond is through same kind of violence. So the violence is justified by not referring to hyper-masculinity of Muslim men, imagined hyper. Remember, it's not hyper-masculinity, it's imagined hyper-masculinity. It's a constructed process. I mean, the love jihad and all of that are part and parcel of it. It's essentially to justify your own violence by referring to their violence as part of the innate nature, but part of also a wider conspiracy. So I'll end with reminding that what it leads to then, of course, is what's an ideal nationalist self in Hindutva imagination, in any kind of imagination? It's one that changes the God. So if you look at the image of not only Ram, and people have worked on Ram's iconography, how it changed in the 1990s. Look at image of Hanuman today. I mean, I live in the UK, I go back to India from time to time, still I look at the image of Hanuman. That's not the image of Hanuman I grew up with, right? It's very violent kind of image. So the change of God, change of religion, change of nationalism, change of India, change of everything. So the entire idea of what a Hindu self and Indian self meant is changing rapidly, because the only Hindutva self and Hindu self now and the Indian self and all of them being equated now is one that's hypersexualized, and yet that hypersexualization is justified as a response to the hypersexualized Muslims, right? It is also violent self, which is justified as a response to the violence of the other Muslims and Christians and the secularists and the communists, and is one that requires each and every Hindu, a good Hindu, to be a good Hindu nationalist and be violent, because violence is the only language that can lead to then an ideal Hindutva self. And that's common across, by the way, again, majoritarian kind of religion, majoritarian kind of nationalist religion. That's common across. I'll maybe the question asked that Turkish nationalism today of the Erdogan kind and all other kinds of nationalism. You could look at the Trump kind of nationalism, Bolsonaro kind of nationalism. Again, I'll refer to my work of various scholars, including Natasha Call, my colleague. She wrote about Bolsonaro, Trump, and others. It's very clear that all these majoritarian nationalists have something in common. That's misogyny, but there's also one that's based on hypersexualization and based on violence. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dibyesh, for setting the stage for this conversation with those important insights. I'm sure we'll come back to many of these ideas in the Q&A session. Professor Sara Farris, over to you now.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. And as Dibyesh, please also call me Sara, not need for professor. Many of the things I'm going to say really complement what Dibyesh said. So I'm glad that he focused especially on Hindu nationalism and on the issue of hypersexualization. As you will see, it really resonates with many of the things that I'm going to say. Well, I think it's important, as Dibyesh already said, to acknowledge that nationalism indeed has a distinct sexual politics, and that is strictly gendered. And I say this because I think until the 1990s, at least, I think that much scholarship on nationalism, at least in Europe and in the US, was a scholarship that tended to focus on nationalism as a phenomenon whose proponents focus mainly on the nation as an imagined community. We have the very powerful metaphor of Benedict Anderson talking about the nation as a community which is in fact artificial, but nonetheless is portrayed and is lived as very real, a community of blood, according to the proponents, of kinship, of common culture and common history, that is entirely fabricated, as we know, but at the same time, it's been an incredibly, and continues to be, an incredibly powerful metaphor. So this is to say that I would say that the motif of ethnic homogeneity or even racial homogeneity has been really central to studies on nationalism for a long time. It is particularly in the 1990s and onwards, especially with the post-colonial feminism, in my view, and also with historians of sexuality. I'm thinking of George Moss and his history of masculinity and nationalism in Germany, for example, that the sexual politics of nationalism is fully investigated, is fully under scrutiny. So I just want to mention three axes quite briefly and schematically, around which that I think will help us to understand in what ways nationalism is deeply gendered and sexualized. So first of all, for nationalism, women are the biological and cultural reproducers of the nation. So this means that for nationalism, women are primarily mothers. And we can see that in the history, throughout the history of different nationalist movements. Whenever nationalism has taken over, we have immediately seen their attempt at controlling women's bodies, at focusing upon women and mothers, encouraging the growth of fertility rates. And we can see very clearly now what's happening, for instance, in the United States, where the fight now against abortion is entirely underway. And we can see how it's been clearly driven by the white nationalism of people like Trump and its followers. The second point I want to make, the second axis of how nationalism is gendered, which I find always very interesting and intriguing, is really to look at the iconography of nationalism. We can see when we look historically at how the nation has been represented, and this is interesting in many different cultures, in Europe, but also in Asia and in other regions of the world, we very often see that the nation is strongly associated with images that recall heterosexual, heteronormative ideas and couples, but also women. Very often the nation is identified as a woman. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this iconography is also present in India, at least at certain points. So the notion, the nation is represented as a woman, and precisely to recall the idea both of the family. We have, in fact, even in the language, terms such as we refer to the nation as the homeland, as the motherland or the fatherland. So this is very clearly meant to evoke the idea that the place in which one is born, or the place that one elects as the nation, is it belongs to them, is the most intimate and ancestral bond. But at the same time, is also a place or a person to protect. Very often the evocation of the nation as a woman, as a mother, even we talk of mother tongue, for instance, is precisely the idea that so we need to protect the nation from the others, the invaders, the foreigners, those who do not belong to this constructed and imagined community, and even as a place to die for. The whole military imagery during wars is precisely the idea that one should even commit themselves to die for this motherland, for this mother nation. So it's a very, very powerful. If you imagine that somebody is willing to die for the nation, you can really gather how powerful this metaphor, these ideas really are. The third axis of the gender and sexual nature of nationalism that I want to focus on is how nationalists, for everything I said until now, are clearly anti-feminist. If we understand the feminism as an emancipatory movement for the emancipation and the liberation of women, for women to be able to choose, to make choices on their bodies, on their reproductive rights, etc. Nationalists are certainly anti-feminists, but at the same time, they are increasingly and consistently instrumentalizing and mobilizing ideas of women's rights, as Dibyesh already mentioned. And this is really part, in many ways, of my most recent research. I use the term femonationalism, in fact, to refer to this phenomenon. And it's a term that I use to describe both the ways in which nationalists and nationalist movement have instrumentalized feminism. Of course, feminism understood in a very vague and generic way, just as women's rights, very vaguely speaking, but is also about the ways in which some feminists have in many ways converged with nationalism, particularly within anti-Muslim campaigns. So what we see in Europe, for instance, but also in the US and possibly in other countries, my research has focused specifically on Europe, is the ways in which right-wing nationalist parties have begun to really mobilize ideas of women's rights. For instance, within integration policies for migrants. And they do it always in the context of their anti-immigration and Islamophobic campaigns. So they would demand that they, first of all, would stigmatize Muslims for being allegedly misogynist, backward, regressive towards women, for not knowing women's rights. And they would urge Muslim communities to, in fact, respect women's rights under the assumption that they don't. And usually within this kind of imaginary, this femonationalist ideology, women are treated as victims, as really agentless individuals, we can say, that don't really that do really what their fathers or brothers or the men of the community really say. And what is interesting is that even within narratives that, for instance, were quite common in Europe in the last few years, or even young women fleeing to Syria and being called terrorists or friends of terrorists, the idea is still that they are victims because they have been brainwashed, because they have somehow been convinced by their lovers, by their Muslim terrorist lovers, to commit to these ideas, to these fundamentalist ideas. So this is just to say there is a certain imaginary of nationalism within which women are, particularly foreign women, not only Muslim women. I mean, the Muslim women is like now the synecdoche for this general idea of the non-Western woman as a victim. But there is certainly a focus upon Muslim women for nationalists at the moment. And I think it is really, what is interesting now in Europe at least, is that increasingly, I would say, feminist movements are, the anti-racist feminist movement is, I think, becoming more alert about these issues. And this is because I would say that until a few years ago, at least, there was a certain tendency, much more dominating within certain feminist circles, to adopt this idea that the religions in general, but somehow Islam in particular, was or is a dangerous religion for women. But I think there is now a very strong reaction against this by anti-racist feminism, which gives me hope, and is precisely the hope to be able to build a feminist movement which is anti-racist, anti-Islamophobia, and also that doesn't fall into the trap of nationalism. But that is especially the hope in the United States, where we can see that this time it is really this very strong idea of Christianity, like these Christian groups that are attacking the rights of women, obviously used by nationalists, white nationalists in the United States in order to do so. I would stop here and I welcome any questions and comments.
Thank you, Dibyesh and Sara, both of you, for brilliantly laying out the gendered and sexualized politics of nationalisms as we see it across the world. So many things to think of from this conversation. So I was thinking of the civilizing missions that both of you have hinted at. That is so common to so many forms of these nationalisms that we see today. The way they converge around this dehumanization of the other, the way they instrumentalize women's rights and LGBTQ rights, which almost appears as a point of convergence, even if the political formations are different, and how these build essentially on racialized and Islamophobic politics. But I'm also thinking of something that you both already spoke of, and which is the iconographies of nationalism and this, dichotomy between, on the one hand, using masculinity, this masculine self to assert national power, while also at the same time using feminine personifications and these common metaphors rife with emotion for the motherland, and how they play out around us today. And especially thinking of savior narratives where, thinking of the leader as the savior who, although takes up that masculine image to assert power, yet, sacrifices sexual desires to appear more masculine, but also lesser on the sexual front in their personal lives. So how they sacrifice that sexuality for a more masculinist, militarized nationalism. So I was wondering how you would both like to speak to that, and any of you could go first. Dibyesh, could you unmute yourself?
Okay, I was thinking, Sara, do you want to go first? But okay, I'll go first now, so that we don't spend too much time in deciding who goes first. No, in terms of, I think there was also a question related to that. Is about the ways in which the leaders present themselves as, in many cases, either not very feminine. So leaders never present as very feminine in this kind of nationalism. There might be women who present themselves as strong women of certain kind, and men would present as men, but almost always responsible. So Trump, in that sense, and Bolsonaro were a bit different. So the ideal nationalist figure in majority and nationalism would be of the Erdogan and Modi kind, right? So when I say Erdogan and Modi, of course, one of them has a family, no children, one doesn't, but they both present themselves as the ideal male figure. And more than that, what they do, what's interesting for nationalist perspective is how their followers and admirers see them, right? And the way they see them as are the ideal male figures. So the mard, in Indian context, in Modi is the asli mard. And how did Modi prove that he's an asli mard, a real man? Modi proved that he's asli mard in 2002 through violence against Muslims. So the idea is you show your masculinity, right, which is a controlled masculinity, by expressing the uncontrolled part from time to time and showing the others their place. It fits into the wider misogynist idea of a strong man is one who shows women and others who don't conform their place from time to time, right? So they don't do it all the time, because then they become irresponsible. Now with Erdogan also, he's seen as the real man when he reminds Kurds their place, when he mocks the opponents as feminists, when he mocks the LGBTQ people as not Muslims, right? So that's something in common. So what common is that even when they are, let's say in case of Modi, they figure, and Hindutva of course privileges the idea of asexual leaders, right? Asexual but hyper-masculine. So they always, while they might be asexual, they're also hyper-masculine. So it's not the Gandhi kind of figure. Gandhi was also seen as, not masculine in typical conventional sense, but Gandhi was seen as a weak kind of thing. So it's about the warrior. So the idea is and that's what Hindutva has done. What Hindutva has done is the ideal masculine leader for them is one that's a mix of warrior, but also someone who sacrifices sexuality. So in my own research, what I came across, and of course, Paula Bucket has also researched on it, many other scholars have researched on it, is the constant story I got from the Hindutva leaders, the RSS and the Bajrang Dal and the VHP leaders, who I sort of interacted with in early 2000, was that you should not waste your energy. Where does energy come from? Energy comes from, in their mind, semen. So the idea is you control your sexuality because you need to devote yourself to the motherland, to your nation. So the idea is you are asexual, not because you are asexual, you are asexual. So it's not asexuality. You are selectively asexual because you need to reserve all your energy vis-a-vis the task of nation building. And the task of nation building starts by not mobilizing yourself, but by demonizing the other and then mobilizing yourself. So I know it's a lot of random answers, but what I'm trying to remind us is that the asexuality is not of the asexuality which we study in queer studies terms, but asexuality is of a controlled sexuality for a wider targeted purpose, which is essentially the target purpose is to demonize minorities and the dissidents and those who oppose you and mobilize a nationalist self.
Yes, I mean, I agree with everything that Dibyesh already said. What I would add is that a very interesting phenomenon that we have now, certainly in Europe, is that the female nationalist leader. So you have leaders such as Marine Le Pen, for example, who has been able, she's the leader of what was the National Front, and now is Assemblement National, which and Marine Le Pen actually has been able to really bring her party to really unprecedented prominence in the French political landscape. If you think that until 10 years ago, the National Front was anathema to France, so people would not vote for it because it was precisely identified as a fascist, neo-fascist party. In the space of 10 years, Marine Le Pen has been very close to winning the presidential elections for the second time. So we are talking about a female leader, and it's not the only the only case. Actually, we have Giorgia Meloni in Italy. who now runs a party. I guess the translation will be something like the Brothers of Italy is the name of the party. So a clearly nationalist right-wing party. And again, it's a woman, and it is a strong woman, strong in the sense of, in many ways, really evoking certain masculinist traits, very outspoken, very strong in the way she presents herself, but at the same time very feminine, according to certain aesthetic ideas of femininity. The same goes for Germany. The leaders of the German party, the right-wing nationalist German party, in recent years, Sara Wagenknecht, again, was a woman. So we are seeing this phenomenon increasingly in Europe. And it's really a phenomenon that puzzles me a lot, because I don't have definite answers to this. Certainly, it goes hand in hand with the ways in which these nationalists have tried to mobilize ideas of women's rights, but also the ways in which they are increasingly appealing to a female electorate. Until a few years ago, all studies show that many women, that usually these nationalist right-wing parties had a lower share of the female vote. The majority share was of male voters. Now it is changing. Many women are increasingly voting for these parties. Now, it might be that the presence of a female leader is appealing to them. But there is something, in a way, I really, this is also a question to you and a question to the audience, if you want to, because I think it's incredibly interesting how all these ideas of masculinity and sexuality about nationalism, which is certainly center on ideas of strength, and we can say being outspoken and determined, so very masculinist traits and features are now reversed into this female leadership.
I'm sure, like, as much as I'd want to ask more questions on my own, we have a lot of questions coming up from the audience. So even as we think of these gender and racial paradoxes that we see, this militarized masculinist awakening, this construction of the other as dangerous through their sexuality, it's also important that we think through these questions of how do we reimagine a nationalist discourse that takes into consideration critical decolonial feminist politics, especially at a time when we are seeing identities almost being exterminated and histories erased. But that's a question I'm hoping we address in the next 20 to 25 minutes that we have. Shreshi, can you please now come in and tell us the questions from the audience?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dibyesh. Thank you so much, Sara. I think from the questions and comments in the Q&A box, we can see people are quite engaged with this conversation that's happening. Our first question is on the anti-national subject. So the anti-national subject, whether internal or external, is often described as questioning the territorial integrity of the nation. So is there a way to reimagine the national beyond territories and boundaries to problematize this usage? And this is for both of you, so either of you could go first. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll go first this time. Well, this is a very difficult question. So if I understand it correctly, they're asking whether it is whether a non-right-wing exclusionary nationalism is possible. I personally don't think it is. Historically, there have been examples, of course, of think of the anti-colonial movements. They have been endorsed and carried out in the name of the nation, of the oppressed nation, in order to become a liberated nation. So certainly there have been times, places and ways in which the discourse of the nation has appealed to the oppressed oppressed populations under colonial rule, for example. But at the same time, many studies show that even when the movement, the anti-colonial movement, was successful, in many ways, those exclusions that are part and parcel of nationalist ideologies, particularly when it comes to women and to women's reproductive rights, have just reappeared and reemerged in many ways. And the example that comes to mind now is that of the Algerian liberation movement. For many years, the Algerian movement for liberation from France was very powerful and really endorsed and supported by the left all around the world. And in many ways, it was a powerful progressive movement. But at the same time, after independence was gained, many of the promises that were made, particularly to women in terms of rights at social and economic level, were not maintained. And according to feminist scholars, one of the reasons is precisely that when the politics of the nation overcomes and overshadows the politics of sexuality and class, inevitably exclusions based on gender and race tend to emerge again. So my pessimistic question in a way is that the politics exclusively based or that only mobilizes the nation is not politics that can be progressive or emancipatory.
And I'll add to that again. So the way I would see is, of course, we have to distinguish between the anti-colonial liberation nationalism to the nation statism. So what we're dealing with in contemporary times in most cases, right? Not the Uyghur or Kashmiri or Tibetan, that's a different one of Palestine. I'm talking of nation statism. The moment you have a link between nation and state, and the nation has, broadly speaking, a state or whatever, what we find is that the liberatory aspect disappears or becomes secondary. And that's a big challenge we face. If it also connects to what Samreen was asking, is it possible to have a broadly progressive, feminist, queer-friendly nationalism? My sense is no. And even if we take example of left, not left and national, but leftist nationalism. Take example of Stalin. Stalin talking about socialism in one country. Take example of Mao and also what happened in China. It's very clear that the moment you have got a strong connection between idea of nationalism, idea of state, whether it's right wing or left wing, all of them operate in a very civilizing, colonizing manner. So the nation state of China today, whether it's a civilizational or state one, that's different. But nation state of China today is no different from nation state of Italian fascism. The nation state of Russia today is no different from nation state of India today. In that sense, all of them are colonizing one, because of course what they want is domestication of all forms of dissent and identities that can be challenging within their own territory to create a strong nation. So something I'll connect, of course, is that when all of them, so if take care of Hindutva is not only about making India strong internally in certain image, but it's also acting strong externally. So the internal and external things go together. So the focus of nation state project, therefore, is about strength. And the strength they talk of is essentially a certain kind of masculinist strength.
Yeah, and I mean, connected to this, people are also, because we're also talking about whether there is a queer politics that's possible, but people are also asking that in recent times, we also see that the queer and trans people and politics is very visible across both left and right-wing nationalism. So what does this kind of visibility and legibility tell us about the constitution of a nation and the changing geopolitics, especially with respect to gender and sexuality?
I'll go first, because I also saw a couple of questions there. You're right. I mean, it's never simple, right? We can talk of certain form of hypermasculinization and link it to the cis male kind of identity or heterosexual identity. That's not always the case. We also know in terms of fascism, the ways in which they operated vis-a-vis what they called homosexuality was quite ambiguous rather than very straightforward. But what I would look at is, in terms of Hindutva, for instance, as an example, is that queer identity and nationalism cannot work together, because I'm not talking of queer identities of identity, but queer politics. Queer politics and nationalist politics cannot go together, because queer identity is essentially about challenging the norms, challenging the dominance. So the fact that you have got certain trans people trans women, trans men, or lesbian or gay people who are sort of conformist and would like to support right-wing nationalism, does not change the fact that the dominant forms of those nationalism may use them from time to time, but is not very comfortable with them. So Lakshmi and Tripathi and others, they may use certain kind of LGBTQ identity to say, look, we are more different from the Muslims and the others, but they almost will never try to put them as in front, right? And you said that visibility of LGBTQ in nationalist, or broadly visibility. Someone also, nationalism is very binary. There is no space for non-binary identities. There is no space for queer identities or queer politics, of course. But even otherwise, if you take example of dominant forms of right-wing majority nationalism or in various parts of the world, they may selectively speak of women's identity, LGBTQ identity when they have to target certain minorities, but they almost never would prioritize it because the ideal figure for them is almost always the old, strong, not old age-wise, but strong, straight white man in certain contexts, straight Brahmanical / Savarna men in other contexts. So it's very clear for me, therefore, that you cannot have a comfortable coming together of queer politics identity along with nationalist identity.
Yeah, I agree with this. And what I do also, what I did in my work specifically was to look at what are possibly the interests of, for instance, a feminist joining the anti-Islam choir, joining nationalism, when nationalists are clearly anti-feminist. And I would say the same question could be made. What could the interest possibly be of queer or LGBTQ movements when they join nationalism against Muslims or against immigrants? Because this has happened and continues to happen. We have outspoken homosexuals in different European countries that are part of these nationalist movements, that are even part of the advising leadership. But what is interesting is that these type of alliances and convergences tend really to be self-defeating. In the case of women, for instance, what feminists in Europe have achieved by joining nationalism, and particularly by joining into the idea that sexism is especially a problem amongst immigrant and Muslim communities. So what they have achieved is that now many funds, state funding that was directed to gender equality policies and programs, they have been taken away. Because the idea is, okay, so gender equality has been achieved in Europe, so you don't need this funding anymore. We are going to put it into programs to help, for instance, Muslim or ethnic minority women, because those are the communities and the groups that still experience misogyny, sexism, gender violence, and so forth. And look now in the United States. In the United States, you had, not just in the United States, but also in France, several queer and LGBTQ movements or prominent personalities joining nationalists, and the work of Jasbir Puara on homo nationalism is precisely about that. But now what's going on at the moment is that the white nationalists going after the law on abortion are also going after civil rights and gay marriage. So it is very clear that those who think they can ally, the queers who think they can ally with nationalists end up being defeated because the logic of nationalism is intrinsically heteronormative. And I mean, even historically, nationalism, many nationalist movements have had many well-documented instances of homoeroticism. Even under Nazism, it is well known that there were groups that were homosexuals. The SS, different parts of the SS were homosexuals, and they have been entirely, after a while, they have been entirely cancelled precisely because the idea was we cannot promote that. You can maybe do it secretly, in your private space, but we don't want to know about it. And if we know, we are going even to kill you or to do something against you, because what we need to promote is fertility, is heterosexuality and heteronormativity.
Yeah, and I mean, something that we haven't discussed centrally to this conversation, but something that's been coming up is also about the usage of advanced technologies. And we see this across the world, the spread of fake news, fake information, doctored videos, much closer to whom we see how the IT cell of BJP functions in the country. So somebody just wanted to ask, how does this contribute to the gender nationalist movement, and also as well as the resistance against such movements? And any of you could go first.
When you say technologies, what do you mean exactly? I'm not sure I understood the question.
So they've written about advanced technologies, and I'm sensing this is not just doctrinated videos and information that is being spread, but also like surveillance and the use of these techniques in the gender nationalist movement projects. But
perhaps the use of social media in general that we see now.
Okay. I'm not sure what to...
I'll just say something because I know we have a lot of questions. So look, I know, of course, social media sort of amplifies a lot of hatred, lethal politics. It's more visible, but it's no different from the mainstream media or other forms of media or rumors. So just imagine the anti-Muslim violence in India was taking place much before social media. The kind of rumors that we know through WhatsApp were also there before. What social media is doing, of course, is enabling very organized and widespread hatred through WhatsApp universities and others, like in Indian context and elsewhere. So otherwise, the way I would see is the new technologies are providing tools both for resistance and for the dominance. But one point I would like to raise, which we have not mentioned, it was not a question, is when someone asks about resistance and how can people resist, limits of resistance. When we critique homo-nationalism, and I do that in my own speeches and everything, I've not written about it. Let's say the homo-nationalism critique of homo-nationalism that Jasbir Kaur provides, Rahul Roy is also writing about. I have a certain disquiet with it also, and I'll express my disquiet here, that when we talk about left, take example of how many countries ruled by communist parties had women leaders. I'm not talking women in the cadre. I'm talking women leaders. Take example of China. Take on Soviet Union, any East European country. So what is it about communism that's supposed to be liberatory? I know in real life they were not, but liberatory, but could never have women leaders at the top. So misogyny is not only a problem of capitalism. Misogyny is very much also a problem of communism in that sense, right? Left, take of sexuality in Indian context. Broadly speaking, left is more open to LGBTQ today. But what have they done in last 50 to 60 years for liberation / support or solidarity with LGBT? Hardly anything. In fact, at one point in time, I recall works of leftist scholars that would be very pejorative against RSS on the ground that RSS are single men and possibly they're gay men. So they've tried to equate RSS with homosexuals, right? So the reason I mention this is because when we have a challenge of right-wing nationalism, that appropriates gendered identity in very selective manner. Let's not also forget the problems of resistance forms of politics, including anti-colonial nationalism today, right? Which is also very gendered, very patriarchal in most contexts, and does not have a very progressive view on gender and sexuality.
Sara, would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, on the issue of social media, well, I guess there has been lots of research on the ways in which various right-wing nationalist movements have used this new media in order to propagate, a certain idea of or information that it's, the whole culture of the fake news. Or the ways in which they have been used to mobilize followers and nationalists. I mean, it's quite well documented. I tend to agree though with Dibyesh. I'm not sure that has made a huge difference. I mean, certainly these movements have been able to, but I would say any movement really, they have been able to gather and to reach out to many more people. And they've been quite astute and good in the ways that they have used the social media. But I wouldn't subscribe to an idea that it's that is due specifically to to the tool in itself. And going back to also the last point that Dibyesh was making, I think it is definitely true that even within the left, the social democratic left, as well as the radical left, the fight against patriarchy or even against racism is still an open one. There are still instances of that. There is a fundamental difference, though, which I think is also important to highlight. And for me, it is that whereas within, we can say, more left-wing ideas and movements, historically, the integration of feminist and anti-racist and queer ideas and principles has been is theoretically, and it is possible in principle, precisely because of the fundamental principles of these movements. The opposite is the case for right-wing nationalism. The integration of those principles is not theoretically possible, it's not possible in principle, precisely because the very philosophical foundations of those movements are opposed to it. And that is why I still see I still see the hope for the future generations, for the rights of women in the hands of women, in the hands of oppressed subjects that will certainly have to continue fighting for their rights, even within those same movements that want to represent them. But in the end, it's really in their hands or in our hands, really, to fight for those rights that cannot be taken for granted.
I'm also, I think, in the Indian context, especially pushed to think of not a change exactly, but building on the kind of violence that we've seen is the mainstreaming of vigilante violence and vigilante surveillance that we see now, in the sense that it converges with the state now, like it totally converges with the state. The state, for example, promoting cyber volunteers who would report people's anti-national activities to the state. So that's one convergence that I'm thinking of as we think of how technologies are being used in these nationalisms. Shreshi, I think we could have one closing question, perhaps.
And I think this is something that's been coming in bits and pieces in all our conversations, and everybody's been asking this. But I think everybody's just looking for answers. What would it mean to queer the nation? Can there be a queer national belonging? And are there any spaces of hopes or any form of queer political lens that we could apply to our politics to sort of become hopeful about the future? And I'd like both of you to answer this.
Okay, from me, I put an article because, of course, we don't have that much time to discuss, but on my wider point of queering the self and decolonizing state. So I put the link, people can watch it. I understand as a queer person, life can be quite lonely. And let me start with personal. It's very lonely because, of course, in general, we grow up being seen as different, as someone who has to hide it, be in closet in many cases, sometimes come out, but also bear the cost of coming out. And so I understand the whole aspect, and I use the word suffocation, but for many of us have grown up feeling suffocated, even while we flourish professionally, there's a suffocation part. So we do require validation. We sometimes, not always, we look for validation, we look for recognition, we look for community. But I would strongly counsel against and why to avoid the idea of looking at the national for solidarity, the nation. And as Sara pointed out, that even when women's identity or queer identity is sometimes appropriated and used by right-wing movements and nationalism, they're almost always abandoned. And even we saw that even in 1930s in Germany. So what I would say is, I don't think we can ever have a queer national belonging. We may have queer national longing, but not queer national belonging. So I do think that we need to direct that longing towards something else. And that something else, I don't have the answer, but that's something else I could start with a very basic thing. Let us work with each other. Let us support each other. Let us understand each other. Let us even recognize we are different from each other. We may not agree on everything, right? But rather than fighting amongst ourselves, let's remember that when fascists come for left, we think, okay, it's left, they're not against religious people. They come for Muslims, oh, it's not against Christians. They come for Christians, they think, oh, it's not against us because we are secularists and atheists. But remember, fascists always come for everyone and against everyone in the end. So rather than wait for them to divide us, which is what colonialists did, what fascists did, it's important that we work with each other, recognize each other with our differences, and remember that this is the kind of belonging that will nourish us and possibly help us survive, rather than having a national longing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I wouldn't evoke ideas of nation. We don't need a nation. We can build the communities based on, ideas really of sharing, caring, of solidarity, which really don't need to rely on ideas of nation. And there are examples in history. We also shouldn't think that this is just utopia that cannot be realized. There are very important examples, and I'll just make one, which I think is really important. The Asian Revolution, which is always forgotten in our historical accounts, but the Haitian Revolution, in the declaration and in the constitution that they wrote, one of the principles is that belonging to Haiti was not based upon nation, was not based upon being born or being part of the nation, but it was based only on having the experience of being an enslaved person and being a fugitive. So Haiti, for instance, became the home to many of the slaves who managed to leave the southern states, for example. This is just one little example. Unfortunately, it didn't last in this way. For many reasons, a reaction in France and so on and so forth. The Paris Commune on 1971, even though it was a short experience, again, it was an attempt to build a community of people not based upon ideas of Republican nationalism. But even more recently, at the very beginning, after the Russian Revolution, the whole idea was precisely to build a federation of autonomous nations that then was completely wiped out by Stalin. But at the beginning, the Russian constitution, as all feminists always point out, was actually very advanced, also for queer people. There were already recognition of legal and unions between queer people, although that was not very advanced. But just to say, there have been historical attempts and examples. Ex-Yugoslavia, what was the Yugoslavian, is another examples of different nations living together. If you speak with anyone from those days, they would tell you, of course, there wasn't a difference. For us, it was totally normal to speak with our Croatian or Slovenian friends, for example. I'm not saying, obviously, these examples are perfect by in any way, absolutely. Lots of things can be criticized, but I'm saying we should also think of those examples in which not the nation, but communities of solidarity and caring and shared principles have been thought and even in some ways realized.
I think we could keep on talking of belongings, of longings, of histories, of homes, of hopes, and we have many more questions coming up even as we have to wrap this up. So let me thank you both, Dibyesh and Sara, for this very crucial, very engaging, and especially urgent conversation of our times that the center will hopefully continue through its other engagements over time. It was an absolute delight to host you both. So thank you so much for those insights. Thank you, Shreyashi, for the curation. We'll see you all next Wednesday as we come together for the final session of this year's Summer of ISHQ, which will be on kinship and queerness. Thank you all for joining us. Eid Mubarak, and see you all next week.